setting the stage for the steady progress of Asia's economic-driven development. Our conference this year will hopefully provide us the opportunity to examine how various challenges and trends we are seeing today are coming together to influence the future of business. I therefore expect that we'll have an interesting and productive exchange of views, and on these important issues, I look forward to everyone's active participation in today's discussion. With the valuable insights on the issues at hand and the inputs from all delegates, the deliberations that will take place during this year's conference will be a great learning for all of us. Thank you, and may we all have a fruitful and a productive conference ahead of us. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Chien-Jen, former Vice President of the Republic of China, Academician of Academia Sinica, Taiwan, and Academician of the Potential Academy of Services, Vatican, to share his perspective on the effectiveness of the measures and other mitigation responses of many countries, and what factors may have contributed to the success or have hampered their implementation. Dr. Chen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear CACCI President, Dr. Modi, Mr. Modi, Vice President, Mr. McMullin, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. It is really my pleasure and honor to be invited to give a lecture in the 35th CACCI Conference. My topic today is lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, emerging infectious disease always threaten human health and sustainable development significantly. The catastrophic COVID-19 pandemic originated from Wuhan, China in December 2019 is a very good example. By November 1st, 2021, there were over 246 million confirmed cases and over 5 million deaths. There are two phases of COVID-19 containment. The first phase was from December 2019 to November 2020, when the vaccine was not available. In the first phase, the only thing we can do is the interruption of viral transmission. The second phase started when the vaccine became available. In addition to the transmission interruption, immunization is another important strategy. Taiwan has successfully COVID-19 containment in 2020, as reported by the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research in October 2020. This slide shows the COVID-19 mortality per million people on the horizontal axis and the GDP loss on the vertical axis. Among 40 countries compared, the higher the COVID-19 mortality, the greater the GDP loss. Taiwan has the lowest COVID-19 mortality and GDP loss. Taiwan was the only country with a positive GDP growth showed in this report. The successful model for Taiwan's COVID-19 containment and economic growth has several important elements. They include prudent action, rapid response, early deployment, transparency, public trust, and solidarity. Dating back to December 31st, 2019, Taiwan CDC officer was aware of the clustering of atypical pneumonia cases in Wuhan on the social website. A reporting email was immediately sent to the World Health Organization and China CDC to request for the confirmation of this unusual public emergency. On the same day, we started our onboard quarantine of passengers from Wuhan. On January 2nd, 2020, we strengthened our suspected case reporting and hospital infection control of healthcare system. Taiwan CDC organized the advisory committee on January 5th and announced the level 1 travel alert for Wuhan on January 7th, the day when causal agent of COVID-19 was announced by the World Health Organization. Taiwan had the first imported case from Wuhan on January 21st. On January 22nd, our National Security Council held an emergency meeting and the Interministerial Central Epidemic Command Center was activated. World Health Organization announced COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern on January 30th, when more than 8,000 people were affected in 18 countries. In Taiwan, we did not lock down any city and did not carry out mass screening, but we used many smart technologies to control the disease. Our rapid and precise response include the prudent surveillance of pandemic status using ICT and AI technology, rapid announcement of travel warning using cell broadcast, stringent border control using e-quarantine system, in-depth situation of close contacts of confirmed cases using ICT information and big data analysis, and enforcement of mandatory home quarantine, home isolation of close contacts, and home quarantine of inbound passengers using digital fencing tracking system and line bar system. And we carry out precision testing of reported suspected case with symptoms or signs, and we mobilize the healthcare system for isolation treatment of cases using big data monitoring, and we also enhanced hospital infection control using disinfection and delivery robots. Taiwan CDC and many countries did their best to share all epidemic situation transparently with people in their own country. The visualization and analysis of epidemic situation had 5 important elements, including automation, real-time, transparency, visualization, and public-private cooperation. A digital quarantine system was developed by many countries to carry out the border control, and inbound passengers had to use the digital system to input their health information and history of traveling, occupation, contact, and clustering, the TOCC. And all this information may be used by this different health authority, and to assure that the physicians in their own country could easily access the TOCC history of their patients. In Taiwan, any inbound passengers have to fill out the QR code web form to provide their health declaration and basic information. A tracking system of disease control was established for symptom report and information management, and an in-phase system was used to carry out quarantine monitoring, and a live bot system was used to provide quarantine care. When an isolated or quarantined person went out of the digital fence, an alert short message was sent to local health authority. The authority would send officers to do the home site visit. The person ran away from the isolation or quarantine place will get a fine. Of course, it was very difficult to stay at the isolation or quarantine place for 14 days. We provided isolated and quarantined persons care and support services, including meal delivery, garbage collection, settlement arrangement, family visit, as well as the transportation to healthcare institutions. Each quarantined or isolated person received the epidemic compensation of $40 per day, and most quarantined or isolated persons complied with the guideline and stayed at this quarantine or isolation place for 14 days. By June 13 of 2021, as you can see on this slide, there were more than 65,000 close contacts and more than 677,000 inbound passengers have been home isolated or quarantined. There were less than 2,000 got the penalty for violating of the guideline. In other words, 99% of the quarantined or isolated person complied with the guideline very well. We thank these 700,000 unsung heroes in Taiwan. They sacrificed their 14-day freedom to assure 23 million residents in Taiwan could go to school normally and go to work normally and live normally. We also tracked footprints of any confirmed cases to identify the hot zone the case visited. We announced this hot zone to persons who have been there during the same period of time using the cell broadcast and urge them to pay attention to their own health status. And as you can see on this slide, when there's a Princess Diamond cruise came to Taiwan, we send out the self-broadcast show message to more than 0.6 million people to warn them they have been in a hot zone during the same period of time. And of course, these contact information-based measures has to be implemented with the consideration of human rights and privacy protection. We have to clearly inform the public before they implement these measures, and the information collected is well kept for only 28 days and used only for the epidemic prevention purpose. For the contact investigation, officials have the responsibility to protect the privacy and safeguard the cyber security. This is a trade between the privacy and disease control for public good, and the principle of proportionality should be well adopted. For example, we had to choose the technology with low level of positioning precision and comply with the law, including the Infectious Disease Control Act, Personal Data Protection Act, as well as Cybersecurity Management Act. For the very beginning of the epidemic in Taiwan, we assure that the public has the open access to the COVID-19 information. Central Epidemic Command Center has held a daily press briefing since January, which generated accurate news across a broad spectrum of media outlets. CECC quickly established its authority and earned the trust of the public. Public trust has had a stabilizing influence on society, encouraging citizens to follow governmental guidelines and rules, and making the public less vulnerable to disinformation campaign. It has resulted in a virtuous cycle of good governance and good citizenship. The more the public trust, the more people are willing to comply to the government regulation. Transparency, public trust, and solidarity are natural products of vibrant democracy. Central Epidemic Command Center has held daily briefing to announce this transparent information. And we also have done our best to provide adequate supply of personal protection equipment, PPE, and other medical material through mass production and name-based e-rationing. The non-pharmaceutical interventions was enforced using the online education and self-broadcast. Financial relief and economic stimulus were also carried out using the e-allocation. We have engaged in the research and development of rapid diagnostic, antivirals, and vaccine, and the international collaboration and sharing of PPE and pharmaceuticals and epidemic prevention technologies. And as you can see on this slide, we organized a national mask team to expand the 92 production line for the face mask, and the average daily production of the face mask increased from 1 million in January to 21 million in May through the integration of raw material, machines, production line, and so forth. In addition to the increasing the mask production, we also use name-based distribution system to allow everyone purchase face masks at a very low price using national health insurance card. And in addition to epidemic prevention, maintaining economic activity and vitality are also very important. Taiwan engaged in financial relief and economic vitality. We shift public spending priorities to emergency measures and provided financial relief to low-income family and damaged industry. We increased government investment and procurement for expansion of domestic demand and accelerate foreign and private investment. We try to maintain the foreign exchange market stability and stock market momentum as well. And as you can see that the GDP growth in 2020 was 3.1% in Taiwan, and the GDP growth rate predicted by IMF was 5.9% in 2021. this slide shows there's a financial relief to damage the industry, including the transportation, tourism, physical entertainment, physical retail, and food and beverage, and so forth. Of course, there's a bonus industry, including this semiconductor, computer, and accessories, and also otaku economy, and so forth. And during this period of time, we changed our working environment, and we also have to work from everywhere and using this online meeting, and we have the online learning and distance education, and also that's an online B2B marketplace become more and more popular, and there's a lot of online exhibition in this Asia Pacific region as well. And I think this kind of outbreak have accelerated the digital transformation of many countries in Asian Pacific region. I just mentioned about the financial relief to low-income families, and I think it is very important, and not only to support low-income families in Taiwan, we also issue economic vouchers to every citizen of all age to stimulate this domestic consumption. And unfortunately, we have a second wave of alpha variant outbreak from May to July in 2021. So we announced our Alert 3 level, and then the school were closed. However, we contained this second wave of this COVID-19 within 2.5 months. As you can see on this slide, that's the peak was occurred in this mid-May, and then gradually the outbreak was contained very well. And as you can see on this slide, these slides compare the cumulative instance of COVID-19 in the United States, Malaysia, Canada, and so forth. And as you can see, Taiwan has one of the lowest COVID-19 cumulative instance. And just as shown here, the cumulative COVID-19 instance per million was 688 in Taiwan. It is the second lowest one next to China. And with regard to this COVID-19 mortality, as you can see here, Taiwan was ranked as the lowest third next to China and New Zealand, as shown on this slide. And our mortality was 36 per million people. And as you can see, that's different countries have different strategies to contain this COVID-19. This slide shows the stringent index of this containment efforts. And you can see here, China and United States have very high stringent index. It means that they have very tightened containment procedures. That's with an average contingency index around 60 to 70. And Taiwan, before that's May of 2021, we keep a very low stringent index. In other words, in Taiwan, we use precision containment of the COVID-19 and try to keep our economic growth. And in the second phase of this COVID-19 containment, immunization is very important. And this is the effort. We try to get the immunization from through this international purchase as well as domestic R&D and manufacturing. However, the vaccination coverage remains low in many Asian Pacific countries, and we have to accelerate this vaccination coverage as soon as possible. And I would like to conclude to say that the containment of this current and future pandemic, we need global solidarity and international collaboration. Infectious disease respect no border, and no country can fight the pandemic alone. An outbreak of emerging infectious diseases needs to be contained at its original site as soon as possible. If the COVID-19 was contained in Wuhan very well in December 2019, there won't be a pandemic And the PHEIC needs to be announced quickly, transparently, and widely. Unfortunately, World Health Organization announced the PHEIC as late as in January 30th last year, and when already 8,000 people are infected in 18 countries. And I think that the World Health Organization should play a better coordinating role with professionalism and political neutrality. And equal access to PPE, diagnostic, antivirals, and vaccines must be assured. There should be no nationalism or deglobalization. Help each other through global solidarity and international collaboration is essential. And for the pandemic containment and economic recovery, I think science and technology and humanity are all very important. And as we can see that all this science and technology development enters a steep learning curve during the pandemic. However, I think that optimal management of pandemic with public health, citizen information, and contact reduction approaches accompanied by health services must be prioritized. Health workers, medical professionals, and scientists must be equipped for making morally and ethically responsible decisions in pandemic. And finally, financial relief, economic revitalization, and sustainable development are as important as pandemic containment. With that, I would like to say that for the post-COVID-19 reform for resilience, we have to pay attention to the interface of human health, animal health, and environmental health. We have only one goal. It is important for us to integrate our effort to promote the overall health of humans, animals, and environment. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Chen, for that very enlightening address on the situation in Taiwan. And we all will learn a lot from hearing your message and some of the concrete measures that were taken over the recent period. So thank you very much for your comments. And there will be an opportunity to ask Dr. Chen questions after the next couple of speakers. So thank you, Dr. Chen, and we'll move on at this point to welcome Ms. Priyanka Kishore, who is going to talk to us on achieving sustainable growth amidst challenges and disruptions in a changing global environment. She is head of India and Southeast Asia macro services. She currently leads Oxford University's Singapore Global Macro Services team, specialising in macro modelling and scenario analysis. And before joining Oxford Economics, she worked as a strategist and economist in the banking sector with the Standard Chartered Bank and ICICI Bank as well. So no one could be more qualified than to address us today, Ms. Priyanka Kishore. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, CACCI, for this great opportunity to share my views on this broad and big platform. Before I jump into the disruptions that we are all very eager to hear about, I'll just take a minute to quickly introduce Oxford Economics. Oxford Economics was founded in 1981 as a commercial venture with Oxford University. It is now one of the world's leading independent global forecasting and advisory firms. We provide analytical tools, forecasts, and reports on more than 80 countries, 250 industrial sectors, and 7,000 cities and regions across the world. Now, what makes us unique, what makes Oxford Economics unique, is the global economic model, glimpses of which you can see in front of you here. This provides us with a rigorous and consistent structure, not only for forecasting, but also modeling alternative scenarios. And the reason I mentioned these scenarios is because, these are what underpin our modeling of key risks, which are based upon some extensive client surveys that we conduct quarterly in our base, and our client base includes some of the largest companies in the world. And I will be leaning on these surveys today to as we discuss some of the disruptions that businesses might be facing in the post-pandemic world. Let me just begin by sharing with you the findings of our latest Q4 survey, which did show up a surprise, because for the first time since the onset of the pandemic last year, what we did see that future coronavirus outbreaks is not the key downside risk that businesses are worried about at this point of time. It is supply chain disruptions, which is causing most sleepless nights in the near term for the next year or so. So some businesses do not really see it being resolved pretty soon. Over the medium term, climate change remains a very big concern, but we've also seen that concerns around high debt levels have caught up, and that's probably got a bit to do with the kind of fiscal response we've seen in the aftermath of pandemic, which has leaned a lot on debt. Now, in my presentation today, based upon these survey outcomes, I will focus on 4 key disruptions, the top one being supply chain, but also, learning to live with COVID, inflation, and climate change. Now, I'm going to say right at the start, this list is not exhaustive. COVID has spurred several trends that were already happening ahead of it. For example, digitization. It could be a disruptor or an enabler, whichever way you look at it and how it impacts you. I already also highlighted debt issues, but as the global risk surveys clearly show, these are the top 4 things that the big businesses are focusing, or rather worried about right now. So let's get on with it. Now, supply shortage headlines are clearly hard to miss. You must be dealing with it. You must be reading about it. And what is concerning is that majority of our clients think that the worst of this crisis is still not over. So we are not past the peak. And if I take you back to around March this year or something, we all kept saying few months, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. It doesn't really seem just few more months anymore, at least in the usual short-term risk tenor, which tends to be a month or 2. And this is actually corroborated by these supply chain indicators that I have in front of you, such as shipping costs, road transport index, all of which continue to show that the pressures are yet to abate. Now, around half of the businesses we surveyed, actually in October, said that they are currently being impacted by such disruptions. Around 1 in 8 businesses said we are severely impacted by such disruptions. More importantly, when asked when they expect the disruption to end for their own business, the most common response shifted to Q3 of 2022 from Q2, which was, the median response for a while now, and we saw that shift. And also, if you look at the red bars, a significant portion actually expect that the disruptions could last even in 2022. Although the good news being that lesser people see now it pushing out into 2023. So that's not a very encouraging response at a global level, but it's good to put things in the Asian perspective, because I would say that the data shows that the situation is not as tight in Asia as the West, and it also does vary quite a bit across the region. This is partly because Asia's supplies issues have more to do with logistics and shippings, like they're unable to get the goods sourced from other parts of the world rather than actual production outcomes and factory shutdowns. Now, of course, those have happened. We just saw Dr. Chen talk about the recent wave in Taiwan, where they've had to take some measures. We've also had second waves, third waves in other parts of Asia. But what we have already also seen, and I will be touching about that more in the next section of this presentation, is that we've kind of learned to see how the impact of that on manufacturing and output can be lessened. So successive lockdowns are having lesser impact on production. So In that background, what I want to share are two examples of how supply chains are working out. So what I have here is the PMI subcomponents for China. And if you see that the red line, which is the raw material inventories, the survey shows that that has held quite steady, actually, even as production has come off in China. And that kind of underpins our view that, China's slowdown is more of a demand issue at this point of time, rather than supply constraints biting into output. We actually think that even the domestic supply constraints in terms of power shortages, et cetera, have started easing. And while the supply delivery timelines have lengthened, it's really not that much longer when you compare with the long-term average for China. So that's on the side of not being that impacted by supply side issues. But the economies that have a larger share of sectors that have complex supply chains, auto and electronics, Taiwan, of course, South Korea, Japan, there the hit has been harder in terms of lengthening timelines. In fact, if we look at I don't have that here, but if you were to look at the supply delivery timelines, you would see that Taiwan is faring the worst. Other economies with these sectors are also hit quite large in terms of longer delays. And what I do have for here is you can clearly see that exports of auto for Japan, which has suffered due to chip shortage, has fallen, almost 14% since March. That's the red line. And IT exports that were doing well so far have also started to drop back. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, supply disruptions will likely persist for several more months. The end is not really around the corner. We're probably not past towards the peak, but it is not an equal source of concern for all. Even within Asia, there are some who are not being hit so hard by it. This brings us to the next risk that that has actually been on the radar for several months now, since the onset of the pandemic. And as we know that now, probably, that there are future waves inside despite vaccination, how much should we actually worry about these future outbreaks? Now, I'm not a medicine person or epidemiologist, but the evidence is out there. What we do know is that vaccination cannot eliminate COVID, at least at this point of time, whatever is available with us, but they are effective in reducing instances of severe illness. We are seeing that come through. Booster shots are being given where available. And what that leads us to conclude is, from an economic perspective, is that in highly vaccinated economies with containment strategies, something that Singapore is trying to navigate right now, the risk of lockdowns with serious economic implications will be progressively lower as you fine-tune those containment strategies and learn to live with COVID. On the other hand, economies that have low vaccination rates and it's actually an very low tolerance, zero tolerance. We know China has zero tolerance or low tolerance. There we could see COVID outbreaks even in future, leading to more disruptions and may even end up exacerbating supply side issues. For example, we did see that happen in Vietnam. While it is grappling with the global supply constraints, it was also hit by its own factory closures in the wake of the recent outbreak. So there is this two-pronged kind of a situation, but I would still say that on the whole, we have seen, and this is something I was referring to earlier as well, that Asian businesses and consumers are adapting to COVID, leading to much lower economic impact from recent outbreaks than the initial ones that happened in 2020. So I've actually charted the aggregate PMIs for you here. And as you can see, the blue line for ASEAN shows the first outbreak early in 2020. And we can see that in Q2 of 2021, when a number of ASEAN economies again went into lockdown to contain waves, we saw them employ strategies for manufacturing to continue, for example, putting in measures like some workers could sleep on the premises so they do not spread the infection while they could continue working. We have seen a number of other economies do that. Even India's very, very ferocious second wave did not have anything of the kind of the economic impact that we saw last year, because the new government conditions and lockdowns were more lenient, allowing for manufacturing, construction, and very importantly, e-commerce, online payment have played a role in terms of limiting consumption downside. So we are seeing that happening. The near-term path will still likely be bumpy, and that goes back to another chart that Dr. Chen shared, which was on vaccination. Several parts of Asia are still lagging on vaccination, and actually our growth forecasts for the region have slipped lower over the past 6 months, largely led by downgrades to Asia. But we are more hopeful of next year. And what I have here is our forecast for by when 80% of population in each Asian economy will likely be fully vaccinated. So you can clearly see that by a second half of next year, a significant portion of the population will be vaccinated across the board. And that's where we think that regional recovery should gain more traction. Reopenings will be more durable, and this should provide a boost to consumption, high contact services, and very importantly, tourism, something I guess we are all waiting for pretty eagerly. Now, in the larger scheme of things, as the reopening becomes more durable and sustainable, we should see Asia regain its position as the fastest growing region in the world. This has suffered a brief setback this year. We actually expect US to grow faster than Asia ex China in 2021, thanks to the massive stimulus that has gone through there, whereas emerging Asia suffered due to lower fiscal support, a lot of damage from the pandemic, and slow vaccination. So that brings us to the end of the second key disruption. And you would think that if growth is picking up, inflation is a good thing, right? You're growing faster, prices go up a bit, businesses benefit. It would be just that, in this case, the inflation data has certainly turned quite intimidating pretty quickly, and that's what's become a cause of concern. Now, the issue is definitely more pronounced for the US, but core inflation in many other major economies now appear to be following the US higher to varying degrees. This is true for even South Korea, closer to home, where we've seen Singapore is seeing a strong pickup in core inflation. Actually, CPI inflation, if I were to look at the 2% target, which the central banks for advanced economies generally look at, has been above that level for advanced economies in Asia, for Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, for several months now. And in emerging Asia, we are seeing inflationary pressures continue to bubble in India, Philippines, and Malaysia. So Asia has kind of followed the global price pressures higher. Still, I would say the situation is not spiraling out of control. And it's not that we are heading towards a new regime of very high and volatile inflation, either globally or in Asia. Just if I look at the blue line here on this chart, we can see that at an aggregate level, Asia's consumer inflation is actually lower than last year. And this is because of a correction in Indian and Chinese inflation, which were pretty high last year. But even the current uptrend seems to have peaked in May. Inflation continued to downtrend in September in Asia, even as fuel CPI rose strongly. We were met with high energy prices globally. And at this point, of the 8 large Asian economies that have an inflation targeting central bank, only Philippines and South Korea's inflation readings are above the target range. So clearly the direct impact of these global raw material shortages and rising input prices has been felt much more on the producer prices, which is the yellow line that you can see there, which has remained above 9% since May this year, and it's rising again. So the consumers have not been hit so hard yet. And to a large extent, this is because of Asia's weak growth performance so far. Of course, we have seen core inflation pick up sequentially as economies have opened up and recovery has gained traction. This is more evident in some places like North Asia, where the pandemic has not left as a deeper mark. But on the whole, output gaps do remain significantly large across Asia, and especially in emerging Asia. If you look at the chart and the longest bars there, with output gaps projected to remain significantly large in EMA PAC ex China, even in 2022. And this has deterred businesses from passing on input costs completely to output costs and kept core prices in check. If I were to contrast this with the US and other major economies, we actually forecast US output gap to turn positive next year. So the demand side pressures are much stronger in the US and advanced world. This is true for certain Asian economies too, in advanced Asia, but we've also seen our central banks react much more strongly, moving quickly to dampen those pressures. For example, the BOK and the MAS hiking. So there is a bit to contain the demand side pressures where they're building up already. Asian inflation also benefits from what I would say are technical factors. So, the composition of the CPI basket. Over the years, the Asian CPI basket has moved towards services and non-tradables, and the share of fuel in particular is very low in the consumer inflation basket. On an average, it's just 9% of the Asian CPI. The highest share is 15% or so for Singapore, lowest share less than 3% for Hong Kong. And that kind of gives you an inbuilt buffer. If you look at the South Korean chart that I've got here, services inflation has also recovered from its lows with global recovery, but it is really not surging like goods inflation, where the problem of shortages actually is driving prices substantially higher. And also, we all know that Asia does lean on administrative measures to contain prices. And we have seen that happen even this time around. There have been subsidies put in place, and they've in several economies to contain electricity prices. Philippines has also moved to cut taxes on some food items because it was experiencing a pretty high food inflation. So I know I've made a case for why we shouldn't worry too much about inflation in Asia. This is not to say that Asia is going to completely escape the global price pressure. So if you look at our forecast, we do have inflation picking up quite sharply to above 3% from 2.3% or so in Q3 of this year. So almost a percent kind of a move over Q4, and it's kind of peaking around that level in Q4. And if the pandemic does generate kind of lasting shifts in how the inflation generation process works, it triggers that kind of shift, we could be headed for an era of higher inflation. That is not a regime shift of volatile and very, very elevated inflation. It is within the current central bank targeting regime. We could just be shifting a bit higher levels than what we have seen over the last decade or so. But even within that, what I want to reiterate is that the impact in Asia is likely to be less dramatic compared to the rest of the world, and especially the countries where demand dynamics are more robust. So we expect inflation to peak in Q4 and a slow downtrend over 2022. The reason it is slow is because of lingering supply side disruptions that we have already spoken about. It's unlikely that cyclical drivers become unhinged. With the global headwinds and a slowing China, which is weighing on Asia's 2022 growth outlook, we expect demand side pressures to remain pretty much contained. There's also very little sign of wage inflation loop forming amid abundant labor market slack. So we do think that inflation is likely to remain below target, barring a handful of places that I have up here. Korea, the one place that continues to see above target inflation. But on the whole, this will allow most central banks to remain on hold through 2022 and move only in 2023. So we do not really see widespread rate hikes happening next year, or very aggressive rate hikes for that matter, maybe a hike here or there. Finally, we come to the last but the very important climate change challenge. Now,
This has actually featured as a risk in our surveys for some time now. But what we did see that the concerns have increased in the wake of the pandemic. COVID has clearly highlighted, I think, the danger of ignoring non-economic and non-financial risks. And at the same time, we have seen changing weather patterns and more frequent natural disasters have increased environmental concerns. So things have come to head at the same time. The COP26 is underway as I present, and we've already had some important announcements, including India's pledge to achieve net zero by 2070. We can bigger, whether that's good timing or not, I don't think it's the place. But what I'm going to say is that yes, current climate commitments will help limit future growth in emission, but we estimate that at the current pace, the world will still be 2 degrees warmer by 2050 relative to pre-industrial levels. This compares to, the 1.5 degree that the Paris Climate Agreement talked about. And this is an additional 1 degree of global warming from where we are today. And unfortunately, as you can see, Asia is going to be on the warmer side, and the economic impact also will be more damaging for the warmer countries of Asia, because we find evidence empirically that there's a non-linear relationship between productivity and temperature. So where, per capita income growth rises up to an average temperature of just under 15 degrees Celsius. So that's kind of a sweet spot. But after, above that, if your annual temperatures are above 15 degrees centigrade, per capita income growth actually begins to be adversely affected by higher temperatures. So this puts India, for example, in a particularly bad position. You can see it's deep red there. It is one of the most significantly impacted countries in our baseline due to climate change impact, with GDP in 2050 reduced by almost 12% in level terms. Our forecast for Singapore and Thailand also have seen material reductions for climate change impact by 10% and 8% respectively. So the economic challenge of this is notable for Asia. So we've discussed the 4 key disruptions, and the question, of course, is what is the way forward from here? I think for most businesses, it just goes back to the age-old practices, diversification, risk management, just looking at it from those angles, identifying, because throughout the presentation, what we have discussed is that the impacts are not equal globally, regionally, or even within Asia. Someone is better placed in some respect and someone is worse placed in other respect. So it's important to identify where your supply is coming from, which are your key destinations in terms of final demand, and build your strategies accordingly. We've discussed supply shortage is not that much of a problem for China, even for India, for example, but it is a bigger challenge for the economies more deeply integrated in global supply chain. Vaccinations are picking up. It's a good thing. It will enable pickup in consumption across the region, but COVID tolerance also matters. And those that, take longer to come with terms with the, or I wouldn't say come to terms, or, to move to a different strategy to allow for reopening, durable reopenings, will probably see a longer recovery path or higher disruptions. Inflation is not such a big concern for Asia per se. It's definitely an important risk, and we need to keep an eye on it, but we are not moving towards a higher inflation regime permanently. We could see an era of slightly higher inflation, but even within that, it's not as a big risk for Asia because of its delayed recovery as compared to other parts of the world, specifically the US, which has seen a lot of fiscal stimulus. And finally, climate change is a challenge not just at a country level. It needs to be implemented even at firm levels, at individual levels. Those goals need to be reviewed and seen, simply because while we cannot avoid the economic impact, the negative economic impact, we can reduce it. And we have to be faster in terms of mitigation and adaptation strategies to limit the economic outfall of that. With that, I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you so much for your time and patience.
Thank you, Priyanka. That was such a comprehensive and impressive summary of where we are and what we can do. And I think your 4 points will be taken very seriously by all those participating today. And I'll just remind everybody that all these presentations will be available from the CACCI Secretariat over the next couple of days. So there was a lot of material there with Priyanka presented us with, and you'll have an opportunity to go over those in your leisure time at a later time. But it just leaves it to me, Priyanka, to thank you again very much for your presentation, and I wish you well with your continued work, and we'll follow your course, your activities with great interest. So thank you so much for being with us today. I'll move now on to our next speaker, that is Dr. Oriol Cordovilla, who's going to speak to us on one of the matters that Priyanka referred to, and that is the digital currency and how it's revolutionising the global trading system and how business is going to work into the future. Now, Oriol is a fintech advisor, a management consultant, and researcher in the areas of digital banking and finance, central bank digital currencies, blockchain, crypto, and M&A. So he's a fellow of the Digital Euro Association and an honorary fellow at the University of Hong Kong. He's a member of the Singapore FinTech Association as well as FinTech Australia. So widely published and the author of many talks and seminars. So it's my great pleasure to now welcome Dr. Oriol Cordovilla, who has the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this introduction. And well, thank you all for inviting me here today. It's my pleasure to be here sharing these few notes and 20 minutes on this amazing and current topic. First of all, I would like to say that today I'm not going to share any presentation. I'm going just to speak because I want to make it much more dynamic. So feel free at the end of my short speech to ask me anything that you want to ask, because I know that this topic is actually quite new and it may lead to confusion. So I'm here to try to make things as easy as possible. As Peter just said, I'm working as a fintech advisor and a researcher. I'm advising a few companies mostly from Asia, from either Hong Kong, Singapore, as well as trying to do as much research as possible on these new and fascinating areas. Also, as Peter mentioned, this last year I've been participating in many international conferences, over 50. It's amazing to see how the whole world is becoming much more digital and much more interested in these new areas. So, first of all, as you know, the title of my talk is how digital currencies may revolutionize the world of international trade. So the thing is, I feel like I need to start from the very beginning. I know that whenever we talk about digital currencies, one may feel like propelled to think that we're talking about cryptocurrencies. But the thing is, we might be talking about cryptocurrencies, of course, but like strictly speaking, cryptocurrencies are not actually currencies because they are not like issued or backed by any central bank. So this is why, actually, as you will see now, most of my talk will focus on central bank digital currencies, which are this new concept or idea, which I'm sure you've been like seeing referred to in the press many times as CBDCs. So, starting from the very beginning, I was talking about cryptocurrencies. As you know, cryptocurrencies are quite trendy right now. I mean, they've been existing for over a decade since Satoshi Nakamoto published that white paper on Bitcoin, thus creating blockchain technology as well. So cryptocurrencies have been a reality for a few years. But I would dare to say actually that it's been maybe like this last year and a half when more people on the media or like mainstreamly have started to talk about it. And this is so because, I mean, among other reasons, I mean, aside from the pandemic, etc., we've also seen many institutional investors starting to tap into this market. So cryptocurrencies are no longer that investment asset class, to put it this way, only used by a few retail investors, or a few are a lot, but still, I mean, right now it's something else. It's much more than that, because many institutional investors, I mean, we saw, for example, PayPal tapping into this market. We saw Tesla. We saw DBS in Singapore creating DBS exchange. So there are many examples of that, many examples of how cryptos are much more mainstream than before. However, even though we could talk for cryptos about hours about what opportunities they offer, what risks they have, and so forth and so on, the thing is, cryptocurrencies in international trade, they still have a limited role. And this is so because, first of all, as I said before, cryptocurrencies are not actually currencies. They are actually considered in several jurisdictions, like for example the US, as commodities. Or we could maybe look at them as an investment asset class, a very, we could say, lucrative, albeit risky one. So the thing is, they are not actually currencies. Not being currencies implies that the role for international trade is to some extent quite limited still. I mean, as I said before, they are not issued by any central bank. They are not recognized as legal tender, with just one exception that I'm going to mention now. They have a high volatility and risk. So for all these reasons, that definition of liquidity that fiat currencies have in their conversion that definition is not met by cryptocurrencies. So that's why the role in international trade is still limited, as I said before. I also said before that they are not legal tender. I mean, there is one exception, and that exception, which I'm sure you know, is El Salvador. El Salvador, as you know, is a country from Central America, which introduced in early September Bitcoin as their legal tender. It was actually a surprising move, but it's not that surprising if we focus on El Salvador's previous monetary policies and financial situation. I mean, it's clear that they needed to do something. They need a quick and drastic change. So that's why they decided to focus on or to adopt Bitcoin as their legal tender. So that's why whenever I say that cryptocurrencies are not legal tender anywhere, well, I mean, that's pretty much true, but not entirely true because there is this case in El Salvador. So cryptocurrencies, of course, can promote financial inclusion and they may have many advantages, but as I said before, from the international trade perspective, we are not there yet. I don't see yet cryptocurrencies being very widely used in that area. However, when it comes to digital currencies in general, international trade, there is one idea that I think we need to focus on, and that idea is that of central bank digital currencies. Starting from the beginning, central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are not cryptocurrencies, even though it is quite common to see on the media certain journalists or articles referring to CBDCs as cryptos. That's actually not accurate. It's not accurate because, as you will easily see, the rationale behind both of them is the opposite. If cryptocurrencies, as I said before, are the flagship of this movement known as DeFi, decentralized finance, therefore not being issued by any central bank or central authority, CBDCs are actually the opposite. They are, according to their own name, issued by a central bank, therefore representing or being legal tender, representing a claim against that central bank. So, I mean, to make it as clear as possible, CBDCs are as centralized as anything can be, because they are issued by a central bank, controlled by that central bank, whereas cryptocurrencies are actually, as you know, the opposite. They are completely decentralized. So this is one of the reasons why CBDCs are not the same as cryptocurrencies. The other one, which is more related maybe to the topic of my talk, is the fact or idea that whilst CBDCs are going to be nothing else but a digital version of the money that we already have, cryptocurrencies actually have a different purpose, as we saw before. CBDCs are going to be like a digital version of our euro in Europe, yuan in China, US dollar in the US. So we are going to be able to make with those pretty much the same things that we can do today with the physical coins and notes. In other words, I mean, we're going to be able to make and receive payments, etc., etc. Whereas when it comes to cryptocurrencies, even though they can and are used in several countries by many people to make and receive payments, I would say that generally speaking, many people still use cryptocurrencies just as an investment asset class rather than a medium of exchange. And that's actually a key distinction as well. No? So these two differences, who issues them and what purpose they have, make CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, something different from cryptocurrencies. So moving forward, a central bank digital currency, as I said, is issued by a central bank. But they may have like different purposes. I mean, you might be wondering right now, why is it like in any country's interest to issue a CBDC if we already have like well, physical coins and notes? I mean, why do we need that new like form of central bank money? Why do we need to make our lives like maybe like more complicated? Well, this is so because the coins and notes that we already have, that we have like been using like for decades, for forever pretty much, are actually not programmable, whilst CBDCs are, as I said before, issued by a central bank and so forth and so on, but at the same time they are programmable money because it is digital, and that gives many opportunities to central banks to try to address some issues. Like, for example, CBDCs may, aside from replacing in the future banks and notes, they may also be used for monetary policy purposes, since they can reduce the lower bound on interest rates. They may be used as well as a tool to improve financial stability. They may be used to try to fight financial crime much more efficiently. They may be used as well to promote financial inclusion. So, for example, I mean, when I talk about financial inclusion, as you know that there is an issue in many countries in the world, like in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Indian subcontinent, in certain parts of Latin America. That issue is the high amount of unbanked people. So CBDCs could be perfectly used to bank these people, thus increasing financial inclusion. This is so because in some cases, these people are unbanked not because they lack any form of money whatsoever, but mostly because what they lack is access to physical bank branches, despite having access to cell phones, laptops. So it is in these cases where CBDCs, same as virtual banking, for example, could play a huge role. So moving a bit forward, I've been talking a bit now about CBDCs, but to be honest, aside from the Bahamas in the Caribbean and a couple of more cases in Bangkok, Cambodia, no actual CBDC has been like issued yet in any major economy. This is going to change soon, though. The People's Republic of China is going to issue its digital yuan very soon, by the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing, now in 93 days from now. So within this time span, digital yuan is going to be massively deployed within China. But that's interesting because the People's Republic of China is going to become the first major economy in issuing a CBDC. Others will follow next. I mean, many more countries in Asia are already testing their CBDCs. Korea is testing their digital won. Japan is testing their digital yen. In Europe, the European Union, the European Central Bank is also doing research in this area with like the goal of issuing a digital euro in some time in around 4 or 5 years from now. The same idea applies to Canada. I must say, though, before like moving forward to the more international trade related part, that CBDCs are not going to be or to look the same. I mean, let me put it this way. Digital yuan is not going to need to look at all like the future digital euro. And digital euro is not going to look at all, quite likely, like, let's say, the digital Canadian dollar. And this is so because each CBDC is going to be issued, well, before issued, even designed and then issued by each central bank according to each central bank's interests and policies, which means that each CBDC is going to be quite different one from the other. However, and I think that's actually the key point, the one that I want to make now, CBDCs, unlike cryptocurrencies, have a clear use case when it comes to international case. Or let me put it this way, maybe. Cryptocurrencies might have that use as well, but we are not there yet. On the other hand, when it comes to CBDCs, that use case is much more easy to see, to put it some way. For example, if we look at China, the People's Republic of China, we will see that, to me, one of the main reasons why China has issued its digital yuan is not that of making Chinese people more tech savvy, because the people in China, they are mostly relying upon paying using WeChat Pay, Alipay, this kind of platform. So it's not just about making them much more digital, because they already are, but it's mostly, to me, about increasing the importance of the yuan in international trade. A country may decide to issue a CBDC precisely for that purpose, to try to increase the importance of their currency in the whole world of international trade. As you know, the yuan lags much behind the US dollar and other currencies when it comes to their use in international trade. And this is so mostly because the yuan, as you know, is a non-convertible currency, which hinders its development enormously. So digital yuan might serve the purpose of helping the yuan become much more important in international trade. One example of that is, and I'm going to talk a lot now about China, mainly because being the most advanced CBDC project helps us try to see how other countries could do it, or what other countries will do in the end. And I'm going to talk now about one free trade agreement known as RCEP, which I'm sure all of you know. As you know, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, was signed last year. I think it was last November 15th, so 1 year ago. And basically, as you know as well, it encompasses a free trade zone of which covers like pretty much 30% of the world's population in GDP. So it's a huge free trade area, the one that will be created thanks to RCEP. So China will undoubtedly use this free trade area created by RCEP to try to internationalize the digital yuan. It doesn't mean, though, that China will be the only one capable of doing so. I mean, if eventually Japan or Korea issue their own CBDCs, they might use this free trade area created by RCEP as well to do so, But still, I mean, China will be quite likely the first one doing so, because they are like the ones that have adopted their CBDC the fastest. Aside from RCEP, China will also use the area created by the Belt and Road Initiative as one more way to promote internationally the digital yuan. And aside from that, I also wanted to conclude by saying that it's not only going to be China, the country like taking advantage of issuing a CBDC for international trade purposes. I mean, any country, for example, any RCEP signing country, may be able in the end to do so. I mean, if I talk about China, it's mostly because China is more advanced. And they are more advanced basically because they started the research of the digital yuan as early as in 2014. So they spent from 2014 to 2020 doing this theoretical research. And then in April 2020, last year, they started the actual tests within mainland China and Hong Kong and Macau. Tests which, as I said before, will conclude very soon by the Winter Olympic Games. So my point is, CBDCs can play a huge role when it comes to international trade, to make international trade processes more efficiently by using this new digital currency. And bearing always in mind that in this case, when in the title of my speech, I referred to digital currencies as a way to revolutionize international trade, I was mostly talking about central bank digital currencies, not about cryptocurrencies, because cryptos, as I said before, are a different world, to the point that they are not actually currencies, even though they offer many huge potential in many ways. But still, when it comes to international trade, I think we should be focusing more on the CBDC area, which is it's quite new, but it's very important. And for those of you who follow closely all this tech-related news, you will see that right now many and many more central banks are joining this CBDC race. So this topic is going to be it is very hot right now already, but it's going to be even much more important, hotter in, let's say, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from today. So without further ado, I'm going to proceed by thanking you all for listening to my short talk. And please feel free to ask me any questions, any doubts. I'm here to try to solve them all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Oriol. That was a fascinating presentation on a very timely topic, and you've really given us a real context for a discussion for all our member countries and organisations going forward. And thank you very much for that. Look, there's a number of important points, and I'll just remind everybody again that the presentation will be available online from the CACCI Secretariat over the next couple of days. So if there was something you missed in Oriel's presentation or any of the others, you'll be able to go back and reflect on it. But now, look, we're going to have a short session on questions and answers of the three speakers that we've had already, and that is Dr. Chen from Taiwan and Priyanka and also from Oriel. So just if you've got any questions, the way we do it here is put it on the chat box, and those questions can be accessed by each of the speakers. I'll try and moderate them, but if there's a name attached to a particular question, well, the particular recipient of the question is free to go ahead and answer them. But we'll have a look first and see what I can. Now, there is a question there, is how can you mitigate the risk of cybercrime and money laundering in the CBDC system? Oriel, I suppose that's directed for you.
Sure. Well, thank you for this question. Basically, that's going to depend. It's going to depend on each central bank. As I said before, each central bank is going to design its CBDC differently according to its own interests and policies, which means that the technical design is going to depend on each one of them. I would recommend you to check the staff analytical notes issued by the Bank of Canada, which are very enlightening. They provide lots of inputs on what technology you can use and how. I would make it short and say that CBDCs will partially rely on blockchain technology. Blockchain, as you know, is actually a very safe technology. So unlike cryptocurrencies, CBDCs will not entirely be based on blockchain, but they will partially be based on that. For example, China's digital yuan is going to operate through a two-tier structure, as we call it. It's like a pyramid. On the first level, the People's Bank of China will issue that central bank digital currency to the commercial banks without using blockchain. But then on a second level, the commercial banks will issue that digital yuan to the general public through the use of blockchain. So as you can see, blockchain will play a limited, albeit very important role in that. But still, in order for you to get more information, I would recommend you to try to check those staff analytical notes by the Bank of Canada, for example. Those are like very good material on this cybersecurity area.
Thanks, Oriel. Now, there's a couple more questions for you, which I'll just go through. One is, are we going to get into chaotic digital currencies market, or should we choose one economy, such as EU or China, before it's too late? What do you recommend?
Well, I think we need to differentiate two different levels. No, when we talk about cryptocurrencies, that's like supranational. I mean, as you know, cryptocurrencies are decentralized; they are DeFi, which means that there is no chaos in the sense that, of course, that each cryptocurrency, each crypto exchange needs to comply with the laws of the country where it is based. But it's like a supranational idea. No. However, when it comes to CBDC, central bank digital currencies, it's not actually that complicated in the sense that we are going to be using each CBDC issued by our own or respective central bank. In other words, in China, they will use the digital yuan. In Europe, we will use the digital euro in the same way that we're already using the respective fiat currencies in each one of our countries. So there is going to be no difference. When I said before that, for example, digital yuan will be used in international trade, that is, of course, like an intention that China has and other countries will have. But still, I mean, it requires time to get there because there is one key idea that I couldn't mention before, and that is interoperability. We need to make sure that CBDCs are interoperable one with the other. So it is still too early to know for sure.
And the final one, Oriel, is imagining that central banks take steps to mitigate. Imagining that there is a well-run foreign digital currency, how do you ensure that this data does not replace a local currency? And thank you for your very enlightening presentation, Dr. Oriel, which I endorse.
Well, first of all, thank you all for attending this presentation. And then, well, I don't think there is actually a risk of any CBDC replacing our own fiat currency, because I mean, as I said before, each CBDC is going to be issued by a central bank, and it is true that I said before that they might be used for like international trade purposes, for example, but the idea is not to replace any other country's like fiat currency. And this is so because unlike cryptocurrencies, CBDCs, they do not like work on this DeFi supranational space. They are issued by central banks, controlled by them. So each central bank will make sure that that no CBDC, no foreign CBDC replaces our money. I mean, in other ways, how do we make sure right now that, for example, the US dollar doesn't replace our fiat currency? So it's going to be the same idea. A CBDC is not that actually different from the fiat currency that we have. It's a different whole idea when it comes to cryptos, but when it comes to CBDCs, that's not actually a risk.
There's a further question, if you can take one more. How will central banks take steps to migrate cryptocurrencies into CBDC? Is there a use case in other countries where central banks regulate crypto like Bitcoin?
Replying to Denise, no, there will be no migration. I mean, CBDCs will not replace cryptocurrencies. As I said before, they are not the same, and at the same time, they serve different purposes, and they can actually coexist. They can or cannot coexist. It's going to depend on each country. China, for example, has decided to adopt like a tough stance towards cryptos. As you know, cryptocurrencies are practically banned in the People's Republic of China, whilst they promote their digital yuan. But it's very possible for a country to be like a very crypto-friendly, like Singapore, for example, and at the same time, in the future, work on a CBDC. So there will be no migration. Cryptocurrencies will not migrate into CBDCs. Those are different concepts. A CBDC is a central bank digital currency, legal tender. At the same time, a country may regulate and allow cryptocurrencies to exist. But in any case, those cryptocurrencies will never like be regulated by the central bank. Those will be regulated by the regulators, and that's all. No, but it's not. There's not going to be this idea of replacement or migration, theoretically speaking. Yes.
Thank you, Oriel. Now, there's a question from Priyanka, and it's basically that how would an organisation like CACCI contribute to the reduction of climate change?
I would never presume to tell CACCI what to do. I mean, at a very basic level, eventually the climate goals that the country pledges are on behalf of the firms, because it is the firms who are producing those emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions at the end of the day. So I think there's a clear case of collaboration here between at an industry level and at the government level. It could come with something as very basic as correct data sharing, because if you report your emissions correctly, it enables the governments to set up realistic targets and work with those, and then you could even at firm level implement some of those measures that are being implemented, let's say at a country level, and which are consistent with not raising global temperature, let's say by more than 1.5 degrees by 2050, which is what the Paris Agreement was about. And the way industry organizations can facilitate that, is they can educate their members to begin with. I know in India, FICCI, which is something like CACCI for Indian industries, has an economic and climate change research division now, where they're working with the government and recommending them on policies based on industry feedback, and it's acting as a kind of a bridge between the firms and the government. So I think those are some of the the very basic rudimentary ways, and not getting into actual implementation recommendations in how things could work out, Peter.
I think this question it can be to either any of the panelists, and the question is, we see some leaders proposing meeting the requirements by 2050, 2060, 2070, etc. Who will monitor, or how it is enforceable if it is? I suppose, Priyanka, you could have a go at that.
Do you mean to say climate meetings? Because it doesn't say what meetings.
Yeah, proposing meeting the requirements of by 2050. Yes, it's not a clear question. I agree with you. Perhaps whoever asked that question on climate control, they've added.
Right. So at a global level, it's basically the UN, the special agencies by the UN who have been kind of monitoring progresses. I mean, they do not have enforcement powers, but they do report how countries are progressing. And countries have task force at their own level. So, for example, India kind of went back to the 26th COP saying that we've met the emission commitments that we agreed to the last time around. But please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, at a global level, there is not an enforcement body at this point of time on climate controls. There are monitoring bodies, but not enforcement.
Well, thanks, Priyanka. I think that concludes the questions. And I'll just remind everybody that all of Dr. Chen and Priyanka and Oriel, their presentations will be available online over the next couple of days. So if you've missed anything, you want to ask any questions, I'm sure we can refer those questions to one or other of the speakers as necessary after you've reconsidered their comments. But each of them have been wonderful presentations. Thank you all very much for your contribution to the 35th conference of CACCI, which is happening virtually, as you know, but we hope to be able to welcome you to one of our future conferences in person. But look, for today, thank you very much for your attendance. I'll now move on to the next phase of our conference today, and that is to introduce Professor Andy Stokel, who is going to speak on the CACCI study on World Trade Organization reform, which is a subject close to my heart and something where we've been very involved at CACCI with developing this study which Andy has headed and which has now been launched only last week and has had a good response. But Andy is an honorary professor at the Australian National University and chief economist of the Department Premier's Centre for Economic and Regional Development. Prior to that, he was the founding chairman of the CIE, a private economic research consultancy. He's one of Australia's leading economists and received his doctorate from Duke University. He's a member of the New South Wales Innovation Council and a member of the New South Wales Planning Assessment Commission. So, Andy, over to you. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for those three previous speakers, and they're touching on some very important issues. Now, as Peter said, this exercise we're looking at the world trading system, and why is that important? Well, international trade is about 30% of global GDP, and it is basically commerce across borders. It's no different from commerce within a border, except there's a few subtle differences, but this commerce across borders is different because of the existence of nation states and because the rules governing that exchange are different. And then it brings in a host of other issues and interventions that can occur. And it's so the state of play in all of this is that this CACCI study has now been launched, and that's available on the CACCI website. And we've also had a webinar by the Australian Trade Minister, Dan Tien, amongst others, but he has acknowledged this CACCI study, and he's encouraged CACCI members to engage with their ministers to put forward coherent policies ahead of the WTO ministerial meeting, which is coming up later this month. And the other thing that's happened is the G20 meeting has just concluded, and part of its communique, it touches on many subjects as you'd expect it to, the global pandemic, global welfare, global GDP recovery, supply chain disruptions and so on, but it also implores the need for ongoing trade reform. And it has a section on trade reform, and I'll put that up very briefly and highlight some of the key words in there. And so there's a lot of correspondence between that and what the CACCI study is saying, but there's some fundamental differences. and a few misunderstandings that need to be clarified, and CACCI members should work and go to their ministers in their countries so that then when they go to the ministerial meeting at the end of this month from the WTO, or whether it's a virtual meeting or in person, they can make coherent input and we'll hopefully see some progress. So the WTO communique meeting, you know, there's always a lot of what I call, I don't want to be impolite to anyone here, but guff in a whole lot of words there, and they're in tiny little print, you won't read them. But the key words I've elevated and in the font. And on trade and investment, they've affirmed the need for an open, fair, equitable, sustainable, non-discriminatory, rules-based multilateral system. Why? Well, it's to restore growth and job creation. They've asked for reform of the WTO, improve its functionality, and that's a big problem. And they recognise the importance of having a sound, predictable, transparent, domestic regulatory framework. Now, I'll come back to those words and I'll repeat those ad nauseum and you'll get sick of me, but that's terribly important. They've also highlighted the importance of competition. And finally they recognise the importance of strengthening medium and small and medium enterprises. And that is CACCI's bailiwick. CACCI represents 150 million small, medium enterprises across 27 countries. And it's high time that trade ministers and bureaucrats around the world recognise that its small and medium enterprises are the engine rooms of most economies. And it's not, they tend to get overlooked because small and medium enterprises aren't very big participants in global exports. But that's not the issue. All small and medium enterprises are big importers. They rely terribly on that. And it doesn't matter whether you're running a gymnasium, you're a hairdresser, a barista at a cafe, you rely on imported product to be able, at the best terms, to be able to offer the most best terms to your customers. And if you're operating and offering the best terms to your customers, then you are maximising their welfare. And if everyone's maximising that welfare in that way, then you maximise the opportunity for the economy as a whole. So this whole thing of trade is a terribly important thing, and I'm going to run through just why it is necessary for even the G20 meeting to advocate root and branch reform of the WTO and what's involved. And in fact, why have we got to this problem in the first place? So the problem comes from this declining of multilateralism and rising protectionism. You all know that the Doha round failed. Before that, the Cancun ministerial failed. Before that, the 1999 ministerial, the Battle of Seattle as it became known, that was also an abject failure. And so this trade thing has been going on for some time. It is not a problem of President Donald Trump, although he exacerbated the problems and brought them to the fore, but these problems have been for some time. And what we're seeing is that the three functions of the WTO aren't really working. One is the negotiating function. For example, we're seeing that it's taken 21 years and still going to try and reform fishing subsidies for something as obvious as don't deplete the global fishing stocks. Next, the monitoring of trade policies. Countries are not monitoring those or reporting those. And in fact, many countries are deliberately trying to use hidden forms of protection. The third one is, and people are very aware of that, is the dispute settlement system has broken down. And in particular, the appellate body is not functioning at all because America has particular problems with that. And they do have some legitimate concerns, it has to be said. The next, so we've seen this root and branch call for reform, that the rot in the system started long ago, as well as some new ones now have arisen. Ariel mentioned this huge, fast-changing world of digital currencies, and that's not all. With digital currencies comes cybersecurity issues, comes privacy issues, etc., 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 as well as just straight-out e-commerce questions and so on. So it's not even obvious where all these issues and what the solutions are. The last thing is there's this lack of appreciation of the causes of this problem, of why we've seen this steady erosion of the WTO system. And that has meant that some solutions not advanced by reform initiatives, by the G20 and so on, are not even mentioned. So why does it mention? In this chart, you'll see from 1988 to 2008, over those 20 years, there was this very strong growth in world exports to GDP ratio. Then the financial crisis hit and the world economy was recovering. And now we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic. And there'll be some recovery if I updated that chart. But you see that globalization has stalled. And in fact, some people think it has gone into reverse. And that's terribly important because if you look at that line there, you'll see that world exports to GDP peaked there just a bit over at 30% there in 2008. So what's caused this problem? Now, there's actually 4 distinct reasons for this decline in the system. One is the rules themselves. Well, what's wrong with the rules? Well, there's a lot of inconsistencies. There's contradictions, there's ambiguities, exemptions, and the negotiating process is based around reciprocity. And reciprocity doesn't make any economic sense at all. So why was it used? It was used because it made good political sense. But things have changed. The trouble with reciprocity is it's basically mercantilist. It's basically saying, if you take my exports, I'll take some of yours. And you think, well, that's reasonable, but it's not, because you are the gainer if you let imports in. The purpose of an economy is to consume. That's what adds to welfare. And by letting in imports, you can increase and improve your consumption. Now, the trouble is, to be able to pay for those imports, you have to sell something. That's why exports are very, very good, but only because of those imports. And so you can see, if the country stopped all its imports, it would stop all its exports. It would be like having a bucket of gold on a desert island. What good is it to you? You couldn't buy anything with it. When you export, you earn foreign currency, you earn foreign exchange. And this is a fundamental thing about trade. Trade is win-win. And all this dispute settlement and the legalism has a win-lose mentality to it. And it's this fundamental misunderstanding that goes to a root cause of a lot of the issues about trade. The second thing is this mission creep. The agenda is too big. In that other slide I showed you on the communique from the G20, they mentioned inclusivity, they mentioned equality, they mentioned fairness. And now these are wonderful, worthy goals to pursue. The trouble is that the trade you've only got one instrument in the WTO. You can either allow the exchange of goods and services across your border or not. You've only got one instrument. And so you can't pursue multiple things with just one instrument. Now, Jan Tenbergen got his Nobel Prize for that very insight. In lay terms, it simply means you can't kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You've got one tool, you've got one goal you will achieve. And what is that goal? What should it be? I'll come on to that later. The third problem is there's a whole lot of new issues to deal with as things change. And Ariel gave you a big run on that, and I don't need to expand about the digital economy. It's fast changing, but it touches on all forms of human interaction. It touches on cybersecurity. It touches on the ability of a country to manipulate through social media the democratic decisions of another country. So we can see a whole lot of issues there arising. A lot of work is going into this, where it might mean, but it's so fast and it's changing that it really needs a whole lot of effort and just a lot of serious human thought. The fourth issue is the declining hegemony or leadership by the US and the rise of China. So in the post-war period, we've seen the US be the leader of the multilateral, open multilateral system, but as their share of global trade has halved in relative terms and have grown in world trade, you can see there that what's happening is there's this jockeying about who's going to influence what issues in world trade. So let me go back to the first problem and expand on it. The first is the rules themselves. You have this contradiction between Article 1, which is non-discrimination, and Article 24, which says you can have discrimination. So how are we supposed to make sense of that? Is non-discrimination a good thing, or is it a bad thing? So why have one rule which says one thing and then have another rule which says another? Under Article 24, because of that exemption, countries are pursuing bilateral trade agreements at a rapid rate. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, a series of bilateral trade agreements with everyone is not the same as an open multilateral system. Because countries act out of their own self-interest, the only discipline on that self-interest is competition. And non-discrimination, openness to all, is not only fair, but it offers the greatest amount of competition. In fact, open trade is probably the single most easiest, cheapest competition policy any country could introduce. You don't need lawyers, you don't need rules or anything, just let the goods in freely and the services. So this open competition is necessary to give the maximum incentive to innovate. And it's innovation is what allows us to progress. It's innovation will allow us ultimately to address climate change. It's an innovation which allows us to solve a lot of these other problems. The other problem is that you have this anti-dumping and export subsidies. So anti-dumping says you can't injure another country. The trouble is, all the anti-dumping tests are one-sided. They're all based on injury. No one looks at the benefit. And if anti-dumping is so bad, then why the Uruguay round on agriculture did they allow export subsidies? An export for agriculture, an export subsidy by definition is dumping. So is dumping a good thing or is it a bad thing? And I've already mentioned this issue of reciprocity, which is based on this wrong mercantilist, export good, imports bad thinking. You'll find right around the world, every Department of Trade will have an export promotion agency, but not a single one will have an import promotion agency. See, the case for free trade is unilateral. It pays to open your borders irrespective of what others do. As Nobel laureate Paul Krugman has said, and others like Badwati, you don't throw rocks in your own harbours because others throw rocks in theirs. Just because someone else does something stupid doesn't mean to say you should copy it. So this is a fundamental misunderstanding and it needs clarifying. Now, the root cause of these silly rules, and why haven't we straightened them out before, is the world is based on a series of nation states where sovereignty over those borders is respected. Ever since the 30-Year War and the Treaty of Westphalia, the one single principle that pretty much accepted right around the world is sovereignty, sovereignty of the border. Now, this is a very powerful thing because what it means is that you've got to have cooperation between nation states is essential. So then you're going to get compromise. And when you've got compromise, you get exemptions and people start to forsake sound economic principles. But let's go a little deeper here. What's the problem? You see, a modern market is sophisticated and complex. Now, none of these markets exist today in the modern form without this scaffolding, the rules. Now, some of the rules are obvious, like secure property rights or the enforcement of contract, a trusted financial system, payments clearance, and so on, plus also the addressing of external effects. If there's pollution, tax the pollution. And also we have standards. We don't allow lead paint to be used in children's toys because it's dangerous. So all this, and there's many, many more, but the right rules for the right market are different. And the reason is because different nation states have different cultures and systems. There's no one right model. You see, and the trouble is, full globalization, perfect globalization for all countries across the world would imply complete harmonization. But you can't have the complete harmonization if you respect sovereignty and for countries to decide what they like to do and what they don't. So we need this, and so compliance, this is a very important point, with the international rules is voluntary out of self-interest. So international law is, sorry, let me go back one there. International law is fundamentally different from domestic law. If a rule is broken in the domestic market, the police can come around and you can be hauled up in front of the courts and penalised. But what if it's another country? Are you going to send in the police and arrest someone over there? The point is, you can't. If you respect sovereignty and it's the one international thing that's more or less accepted around the world, then a rules-based system, as the G20 argues for, is hollow words unless you've also got a system of compliance. And compliance only occurs out of self-interest, that it's in your own interests to trade and facilitate as much trade as you can. So then the second issue is we've got this mission creep. I've already mentioned this. You've got one tool to affect trade. You can control the flow of goods and services over your border. Now that can happen in many different ways, a tariff, a quota, a regulation here, a local procurement requirement there. It doesn't matter, but you've only got one tool and you can't kill those two birds with one stone. And yet what do we find in all these goals put forward to the WTO? Human rights, labour standards, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to see all those other issues that sustainability are important, they're in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that all countries of the world have signed on to. Now, it's very important to understand that it's legitimate for the governments to pursue those goals. These are very worthwhile. People don't just want improved living standards. They want clean air and safety and human rights and all these other issues. That's fine. But the trouble is the WTO the right way to get that? You've only got one tool. So how are you going to pursue all these other multiple things with just one tool? So we need to go back and say, look, what is the best way and the right agency or whatever might be the case to address that worthy sustainable development goal that you've there? Because the trouble is, what's happening now is trade has become weaponized, and that just sets the WTO up for failure. Now, right around the world, multilateralism, something that's endorsed by the G20, as it should, is strongest when the world unites around one goal. So there's problem number one, two there, give one goal for the WTO. Problem number three is these new issues unaddressed, and I've already mentioned these. I can skate through these issues very quickly. Not only the digital revolution, but we've got intellectual property is a huge issue. The reason is it's a pure public good. Because intellectual property is a public good, it is non-rival in the sense that I can consume an idea as well as anyone else. And because of that, it pays for ideas to be freely available. We'll get the fastest uptake and get the fastest economic progress and the fastest addressing environmental issues and everything else by making these ideas freely available. The trouble is, and here's the conundrum, the trouble is what is not produced can't be consumed. There has to be an incentive to produce those ideas. And we've fixed that problem by giving a partial temporary monopoly to the creator of those ideas, to give them a reward to produce more ideas. Now, what's the right thing there to happen? And a lot of these intellectual property issues are in a lot of these free trade agreements. It needs looking at again. So the question here, ultimately, of all these other sustainable development issues is what forum, in what way should you address them? And we're not doing that. The last one is this changing hegemony of the leadership in the world. We've seen the rise of China. You're all very familiar with that. In the past, the US gave that sort of leadership of the multilateral system. It is no longer the dominant power, but any country, the US or whatever, can still dominate good ideas. And the other thing is that countries now, and what we'll see is countries merge towards forming coalitions. And CTPP is sort of one kind of move towards that. So the calls for WTO reset, Bretton Woods reform, there's even calls for a Bretton Woods agreement by the IMF chief, and it may all come to that at the end of the day. So what should we do? Well, the first thing to do is adopt this common, simple purpose for the WTO system. In the report that is sent around, and people there, it's this one here, we go through there and we say, look, really the purpose of trade is to give each nation state the best opportunity to improve its living standards, consistent with pursuing its sustainable development goals. The second thing is, well, once you've got that, well, how are you going to get there? What are you going to do? This thing, you need to adopt and apply a set of principles to achieve that. Well, what are those principles? In a sentence, it would be an open, non-discriminatory, rules-based multilateral system with this proviso, where interventions in trade only occur where the national benefits exceed the costs. So you could strip out most of those articles in the WTO with just one exemption, do a proper benefit cost test. Now, if you're going to do a test, well, then you've got to have a transparency institution in each national capital to assess this. The fourth thing to do is to stop mission creep, as I've already mentioned. The fifth thing, we should multilateralize all these preferential trade agreements. Countries are not assessing, even if they're in their own interests, because what happens with the preferential trade agreements, while it might create some trade, it also can divert trade. In fact, one series of studies covering 18 bilateral trade agreements found that 12 of them left the country worse off. Next, a bilateral trade agreement cannot get at the issue of subsidies. It can only really you can only tell where the goods are coming from, which country. And even then, that's difficult because you have to then define what is a Mexican good or not. You have to have these rules of origin. And they become very complicated. The regulatory burden, particularly for small and medium enterprises, is absolutely enormous. The sixth thing to do is we only permit subsidies that address market failures and externalities. So the reason here is that subsidies can be good or they can be bad. Subsidies to increase vaccine production in the COVID pandemic are a good thing. Other subsidies can distort trade and can be bad. So again, the best way to sort that out is adopt step 3 there, the domestic transparency institution. The seventh thing is to put anti-dumping on both a cost and benefit test, because there's two effects when there's dumping. There's the effect on the local producer, the injury, and that's real, and that's bad. But there's also a benefit to the consumers. And often the consumers are people, intermediaries on the supply chain, the other fellow businesses. We should look at both the benefits and the cost and get a balanced view of that. There's some other things there, and I can skate through these because some of them, like special and differential treatment, the digital economy rules, intellectual property, and the dispute settlement, just fundamentally need further work. I've read a lot of that material, particularly coming out on the digital economy in the OECD, and it's not clear to me, at least, exactly what you do, what specifically is the step you'd make with a policy change covering those things, and even who would do it. The 12th thing there is we should allow plurilateral agreements if they're open. The reason is because once you have a consensus for the whole world economy, you are tied up to the speed of change by the slowest ship in the convoy. In this slide here, the narrative is international trade is commerce across borders, buying and selling happens in markets. We need the right rules. The rules are pointless unless we comply with them. Domestic law is different from international law, and countries cannot act in their own self-interest if they do not know what is in their interest, and that's what domestic transparency does. Why don't I conclude there, and people can have the slides and look at them later. Thank you, Peter. Sorry I went over.
So thank you very much, Andy, and that was a great presentation. I'm going to move now on to Anja Ellard to welcome her. Very warm welcome to you. She's going to speak on making the World Trade Organization more adaptable to the economic and trade realities of today. Angela is the World Trade Organization Deputy Director General since June 2021. She served in the US Congress as Majority and Minority Chief Trade Counsel for over 26 years. She's internationally recognized as an expert on trade and international economic policy. So there's hardly anyone more qualified to respond and to join us with comments on the topic of making the WTO more adaptable to the economic and trade realities of today. Over to you, Angela.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Good afternoon from Geneva. It's a great pleasure to speak to CACCI today and to its members. Thank you for the invitation. First of all, I'd like to congratulate CACCI on its 35th annual conference and its leadership over the past 55 years. You've made an important contribution into increasing business interaction and enhancing economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you also for the policy statement and the accompanying report that you've transmitted to my colleague, Deputy Director General Gonzalez. I met with CACCI and its members in my previous role on Capitol Hill in the US, and I look forward to my continuing collaboration in my new capacity at the WTO. Today, I'm going to speak about how the WTO can address the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as how to address some of the challenges that the organization faces today. Let me start with COVID, which brought the global economy to a standstill for a significant period. When the pandemic struck, production and consumption across the world scaled back, and international trade appeared to be on its way to a persistent decline. However, in the summer of 2020, global merchandise trade began to recover, and by the end of the year, it was strongly rebounding in many countries and sectors, but not all. In the first half of 2020, global trade continued to grow as value chains recovered and demand in advanced economies increased. According to our latest WTO forecast, the volume of global merchandise trade is predicted to grow by 10.8% in 2021, followed by a 4.7% rise in 2022. WTO rules have slowed and even prevented countries from taking very damaging measures. And our trade facilitation agreement, although not designed with the pandemic in mind, has played an outsized role in worldwide recovery. Countries that have embraced and rapidly implemented trade facilitating measures and infrastructure have generally proven more resilient, more adaptable, and better equipped to keep trade flowing despite COVID-19 related lockdowns, travel restrictions, and social distancing. However, many developing countries are not experiencing the same economic growth pattern, and this trend is deeply concerning because the economic recovery rate is predicted to be faster for countries with higher vaccination rates. For many developing countries where vaccination rates are low, on average 3%, the path to recovery will be long and uncertain unless urgent measures are taken. So, first and foremost, we need to make sure that people in developing countries have broad and unfettered access to vaccines, therapeutics, and other essential products and technologies needed to combat the pandemic. This is not just a moral imperative, but also a strategic and economic one. And as you note in your policy statement, free trade is the only solution to this problem. In fact, contributing to the global effort to combat the pandemic, in particular ensuring equitable access to vaccines, has been one of the top priorities of the WTO administration and membership. Our work has been focused on two dimensions: supply chains and intellectual property waiver negotiations. As regarding supply chains, we all know that producing vaccines is an extremely complicated process involving facilities in many different countries. And this means a lot of cross-border shipments of vaccine ingredients. Think about vaccines as a puzzle that comes together only when you have all the right pieces, but those pieces are strewn all over the world. Trade enables the cross-border transfer of technology and development of supply chains for COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing. Trade helps manufacturers of vaccines and other products necessary to combat the pandemic to source highly specialized inputs that are not produced at home. The WTO has played an important role in keeping the supply chains open and scaling up vaccine production. In this regard, I highlight our work in preparing a list of trade-related bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures on critical products to combat COVID-19. The WTO has also prepared an indicative list of critical COVID-19 vaccine inputs and a report on vaccines production and tariffs on vaccine inputs. This work is intended to help policymakers see the blockages and opportunities. All of this may sound simple and straightforward, but it's not. Governments need to know what exactly goes into a vaccine and what are the products necessary to distribute and administer it to make the necessary policy decisions to remove tariff and regulatory restrictions on imports of such goods. And while the average tariff on vaccines is merely 0.76%, average tariffs on vaccine ingredients, such as preservatives and adjuvants, are anywhere from 3 to 16 times higher. Pandemic response, insofar as it concerns export restrictions, trade facilitation, and regulatory coherence, is on the agenda for our 12th Ministerial Conference, which is less than a month away. And we're also striving to develop a framework for addressing future pandemics. Ambassador Walker of New Zealand is working with members to forge a ministerial outcome in this area. The second stream of our pandemic-related work negotiations is focused on the proposal by India and South Africa to waive obligations under the WTO TRIPS agreement with respect to intellectual property. While those discussions are not as far along, it's essential to see a balanced and effective outcome. Our experience with the pandemic has once again confirmed that trade has been and remains a powerful engine for economic growth. But we can't take the ability to trade for granted. Exporting to foreign markets requires effort, and business needs to have confidence that the operational framework of trade is predictable, transparent, and relatively consistent. And this is where the WTO, as the guardian of multilateral trade rules, comes into play. But there's no way around the fact that the last few years have been difficult for the WTO and for trade's reputation in general. The key element permeating discussions in the WTO these days is that we all acknowledge that the WTO needs reform. This was the Director General's message when she ran for the office, and we hear it from countless WTO members, academics, and business representatives. And certainly Andrew made a very good case as well just now. So how can we make the WTO stronger? In my view, the best way to repair the organization is to achieve results in key areas of our work. The upcoming 12th Ministerial Conference is an important milestone that offers a great opportunity for us to achieve concrete outcomes. In addition to the pandemic work that I've just described, our top priority is to conclude the fisheries negotiations, which have been ongoing for 20 years. In those 2 decades, we've witnessed a sharp and alarming decrease in global fish stocks, which particularly threatens vulnerable artisanal fishers and damages ocean ecosystems. Delegations are showing increasing engagement, and many are now signaling new flexibilities. We need to capitalize on all elements of convergence that are emerging as time is short. At this stage, we need political decisions to get to a balanced and robust outcome. This is important for the livelihood of millions of fisherwomen and men from coastal communities, and for the oceans and the fish. And it's important to the credibility of the WTO as well. So even if you're not focused on this negotiation, you should care very much about the outcome. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought about unprecedented growth in the digital and e-commerce sectors, which proved to be a lifeline for many businesses, including small businesses. It's estimated that the share of e-commerce in retail sales has risen from 16% in 2019 to 19% in 2020. The WTO can create a harmonized, policy-based framework for e-commerce to develop in an inclusive manner. At the same time, while acknowledging these benefits, many members have also raised concerns regarding their ability to harness that potential given the digital divide. Some prevailing challenges in infrastructure, finance, resources, and governance still hinder broader e-commerce uptake. These concerns need to be addressed if e-commerce is to continue to play such an important supporting role in the global economic recovery. WTO members have deepened their engagement on e-commerce issues, both under the multilaterally agreed work program on e-commerce, as well as under the Joint Statement Initiative plurilateral discussions among 86 members co-convened by 3 Asia-Pacific countries. 65 of our members have completed negotiations for a Joint Statement Initiative on domestic regulation, aimed at ensuring that existing market access and national treatment commitments are not nullified by opaque and complex authorization procedures. The draft text contains a novel provision on non-discrimination between men and women in the context of authorization procedures for service suppliers. This will be the first provision of its kind in a WTO negotiated outcome. As we know, there are many MSMEs in the services sector, and they will be the major beneficiary of the new rules on domestic regulation and e-commerce. Another area where we see progress is environment and climate change. Of course, the WTO is not the place to establish global climate policy and how goals will be reached. We see that happening this week in Glasgow. But the WTO plays an important role because its rules govern measures and instruments that are relevant for implementing climate policies, such as tariffs, subsidies, and even regulation. To transition to a low-carbon economy, countries need affordable access to advanced technologies. And open trade plays a critical role in providing such access. For example, the WTO can bring down tariffs on goods needed to get to net zero, such as solar panels and wind turbines, through an environmental goods agreement. The international community is now converging on the urgent challenges of climate and sustainability. Therefore, at MC12, we need a clear political signal from trade ministers that they recognize the importance of addressing these challenges, in particular through trade. In addition, we need to update our rules on agriculture, an important and challenging issue for many members. While negotiations are proving difficult, many members believe that MC12 must have an outcome on agriculture. Members have been working on draft ministerial text circulated by the chair of the negotiations. But gaps persist on the key issues of domestic support and public stockholding, which will set the level of ambition for the overall agriculture outcome. But if they are still out of reach, we should at the same time still aim for outcomes on food security and transparency, and set a clear path for addressing other issues, such as the special safeguard mechanism, cotton, export competition, and market access. Finally, both old and new rules are toothless if there's no effective and efficient way to enforce them. We need to reform and revitalize the WTO dispute settlement function to make sure that members can seek redress and that there are effective remedies to violations of WTO rules. The importance of a successful MC12 can hardly be overstated. It's necessary to show that the WTO is back on track, fit for addressing the challenges of the 21st century, and can deliver for members and people relying on trade to drive a strong economic recovery. To get there, we need a strong commitment and political will from all WTO members and from the business community to get tangible results. At the same time, we have to be realistic because some issues may be more difficult and won't conclude at MC12. For such issues, MC12 may focus on working toward a future outcome with work programs to be developed in some areas. It's also important to work to restore trust between members, which has been shaken over the years. This is particularly visible in the relationships between developed and developing country members of the WTO. Some developing countries feel that they are precluded from taking full advantage from the benefits and flexibilities provided to them as developing countries. By contrast, some developed countries have expressed concerns that certain countries with a high level of development unfairly benefit from being self-designated as developing. MC12 is a good opportunity for members to listen to each other and increase the level of trust through specific outcomes and by setting the table for next year. I'd like to conclude with a plea. If you value the WTO, then it's important to make the case that it's relevant and that it's worth improving and modernizing, to make the case to the rest of the business community and to your governments. We can't take for granted that everyone believes in the value of trade and establishing a rules-based system governing trade. We at the WTO very much appreciate your views on what reforms are needed, as expressed in your policy statement. CACCI and its members are well placed to make outreach directly with decision makers in the region, as well as with the public at large. We have to demonstrate where the WTO has been successful, be honest about where it's not, and be ambitious as to how we can make it better. Businesses must be a voice for good on matters that are in their immediate interest, as well as broader issues like climate change, fisheries, and access to vaccines. We count on you. Many thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments, and I look forward to working with you in the years to come. Thanks very much.
Well, Angela, thank you very, very much for that enlightening presentation. Thank you for your time, and you will know from reading Andy's report and hearing him today that we're with you on these issues, and we are an organisation of 27 countries in our region that are all engaged in these issues, and it's important that the people listening to the presentation tonight and to Andy's presentation and some of the earlier presentations raise these issues with the trade ministers in their home countries, because we had in Australia a very successful session with the Australian Trade Minister only a week ago. But we really want to roll these out through our member organisations to alert already engaged trade ministers, but the importance of these issues and how they're presented. So look, it's wonderful to have had you with us today, and thank you very much for your time. We're going to have a reasonably brief question session, unfortunately, because where time is limited. But I have one question here for you, Angela. Why not just lift vaccine patents to encourage widespread production of the most effective and longer lasting vaccines? The trade-off is quicker revival of trade to stimulate economic recovery.
Well, I think that in terms of how trade can stimulate economic recovery, as I mentioned, the key here is pandemic recovery in terms of the health issue, and then how it relates to the economic issue. The world is never going to get back on its feet, and this is developing as well as developed countries, unless the whole world is able to recover from COVID and life goes on in the way that we remember. But it's very difficult to do that if people in developing countries don't have the same access to vaccines. So I really cannot emphasize enough how fundamental that question is. So the work of the WTO in trying to address this from a practical perspective, to make sure that the roadblocks, the blockages are known, that policymakers know what they can do to address supply chain deficiencies, how they can build more resilient supply chains. We've undertaken an effort to get the business community to talk to each other, working with other international organizations to try to identify what some of these blockages are. It was really very interesting to me to see how business really hadn't talked to each other very much. So the WTO was, I think, took on a very important role in that. And so I think that continuing that effort is very important, a very practical effort, so that business and governments can make decisions that are sensible, and that helps bring vaccines directly to people, increasing manufacturing all over the world. Now, at the same time, we have the intellectual property issue, and that's still very much hotly debated. And then, of course, on climate, which is a huge crisis, as we all know. And there's so much that the WTO has been trying to do, but we really need more of a mandate, more of a sense from our members about the importance of addressing climate through trade. It's not the only way to address climate, of course. We have to see emissions reduced, but at the same time, trade is such an important vehicle for countries to reduce their emissions by trading more in green goods, technologies, making it so much easier to cross borders. So those are two examples, I think, where trade is so important for our economic recovery now and as well moving forward.
Thanks, Angela. Look, there's a few questions here. Sorry. Is there any observation system in the World Trade Organization to observe and control if there's any violation? Where should we report to?
Well, the dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO is run through the government. So if you see a problem, the first thing to do is to go to your government to pursue this, because we have what's state-to-state dispute settlement. But I would say that not everything has to go to dispute settlement. In fact, dispute settlement is the last resort. The idea is to try to resolve problems before they start, and to also engage in consultations and discussions about how these problems can be avoided, or once they've begun, how they can be, how trade can be revitalized again. So we have in the WTO a very important monitoring and review mechanism that's been very effective in identifying problems before they begin and before having to go through a lengthy dispute settlement mechanism. We just had these trade policy reviews, these periodic reviews for China, Korea, and Russia. And it's a 2-day opportunity for countries to sit down and talk about some of the problems that they face. And every WTO member is reviewed periodically, so everyone has their chance in the hot seat.
Well, Angela, thank you so much. There's a bit of echo. No, that's better. The question and answer session, I'm happy to abbreviate. Unfortunately, time is on the wing. But look, there are other questions, and I just encourage people to send the questions either to CACCI or to Angela directly. And I'm sure you'll receive an answer, but and we'll pass them on to you in any event. And also remind everybody that all the presentations tonight will be available in the next couple of days via the CACCI Secretariat for people who want to ponder some of the comments and observations more thoroughly than they're able to all in one session. But a great session, Angela. Thank you so much, and good luck with all your work. And thank you, Andy, for your presentation and the work that you put into the study, and each of the earlier speakers, a great contribution to our conference. I'm pleased to be able to announce that the next conference in November 22 will be held in Melbourne, Australia. And I look forward to welcoming you all there, if that can be fitted into your busy schedules. So I'm going to wrap up the session there. We've gone a bit over time, but I'm very glad to see that most of the people on the call have remained with us throughout, which is a reflection of how much interest the speakers generated. So thank you so much, all of you, and thank you everybody for attending. And I'll now wrap up the session with a video about Melbourne. So look forward to seeing you at the 36th CACCI Conference in Melbourne in November 22.